Guys, I hope you enjoyed that intro. Now the first matchup we're going to be looking at is Lavaloon with Void. And Lavaloon Void is actually a really good matchup for 2.6, but winning completely revolves around having the correct strategy. So I'm going to be sharing a bunch of tips quite quickly and hopefully you guys keep up with it. So the first tip I want to share is what you should be doing in single elixir. In single elixir, your goal is to not allow them to build a big push. So that means whenever they go for a lava hound in the back, or they go for a support troop and then plan on putting a lava hound in front, you want to apply as much pressure opposite lane as possible. So that normally means going Ice Golem Hog, but if you don't have it, you can go for an Ice Golem Hog plus Ice Spirit or Hog plus Skeleton, something like that. And the reason is that by not allowing them to build up a big push, you can then go for your Musketeer in anti-Void placement, and you'll get that positive elixir trait, and there's nothing they can do about it, especially in single elixir. You need to keep track of their cycle, which is my next tip, in that if they go for a Valkyrie, especially in single, and you go Ice Golem Hog, you're not going to have a good way of then defending that Valkyrie with your cycle cards. You're going to have to commit, a cannon or a fireball or musk or something, and none of which you want to cycle. So make sure you're going for, a Hog plus an Ice Spirit. If they have Valkyrie in cycle, then you can use your Ice Golem to kite the Valkyrie, and you won't be down too much elixir. My next tip is that you really need to keep track of their Evo Valkyrie. Now this isn't a tip that mainly applies to double elixir, but in double elixir when they get that Evo Valkyrie, it's going to full counter your Hog. So there's two things you can do about it. The first one is going for an Ice Spirit. That's kind of obvious, everyone knows that an Ice Spirit freezes the Valkyrie enough for your Hog to get outside of the Nado loop and then let your Hog get to the tower. The next one, which I think most lava players don't even know themselves, is that Ice Golem, the slow down death damage or death pop from an Ice Golem. That slow effect is enough for your Hog to get outside of a Nado loop of an Evo Valkyrie. So if you go Ice Golem Hog and they go Evo Valkyrie and Ice Golem pops, that's another way you can get your Hog to the tower, even when they have an Evo Valkyrie cycle. The next thing that I want to mention is when you're in double elixir, that's also when they're not only going to have Evo Valk, they're going to get Evo Zap in cycle. And Evo Zap plus Void full counters a Musketeer no matter where it's played. So that means you need to change up your strategy to cycling either 2 Musketeers or 2 cannons. 2 cannons, especially if they have balloons, you can just pull it to King Tower and get that activation. Or usually you just try and cycle 2 Musketeers, you let that first one die to their spells because that can't be countered, and then you already have another one in cycle and they can't kill the second one. In this case, that he's playing Miner with Void, which makes it kind of a harder matchup. The final thing I want to say is you guys want to try your best not to tower trade in this matchup. It's actually kind of bad, and that's just because they get too many placements, and when they go lava in the pocket and they can get 2 lava hands down, it kind of becomes hell to try and defend that. So make sure you're trying to optimize your strategy to single tower games, just like this. Now, the next matchup that we're going to be going over is Evo Pekka Evo Goblin Giant. This is also a really good matchup for 2.6, but it's one that's extremely easy to lose, mainly because of the defense. Defense can be a little tricky, so I'm going to go over everything you need to know for this matchup. The first tip that I want to give is you need to know exactly what this deck is. It's the second most popular and highest win rate deck in the game right now, so you need to know what counters it has to the Hog Rider other than just the Pekka. The 2 other counters in this deck are the Fisherman and the Guards, and the Fisherman can be bypassed just by going like Ice Golem Hog, for example. There is a tech that you can do with Hog and Skeleton, but I won't go into that too much, but let me know in the comments if you want me guys to show you that. And the other card that counters Hog Rider is Guards, which can be countered with either Hog plus Log and Ice Spirit, or Ice Golem Hog and a Log. So you need to make sure that when you outcycle the Pekka, they're going to use one of these 2 cards to counter your Hog. And you don't want to make a play, for example, going for a Hog into when they have Fisherman in cycle, you get no hits and life sucks. So the next tip I want to take, which is kind of similar to the one I said about the Lava Void matchup, is that you always want to take Fireball value on the Mother Witch. This time it's not Skeleton Dragons, but the Mother Witch is a card that you can always just Fireball with the Tower and the Mother Witch. The next tip that I want to give you guys, and this is a big one, especially something that I've learned in this matchup, and generally against Pekka, is that you want to be kiting Pekkas near the bridge. Unlike Valkyries and Knights and things that you kite 2 or 3 tiles, even 4 tiles from the bridge, you want to be kiting the Pekka at the bridge so that it's as far away as possible from your troops and from your building, your cannon. Especially when you Evo Pekka in the back and you've already used your Hog. This is the next tip, by the way. You want to be cycling your cannon first. That is a default play, that when they go Evo Pekka in the back, you go for your cannon first. Assuming you don't have Hog Rider in cycle and you need to defend, that's the way you defend, because they're probably going to void your second cannon or your first or your musketeer. So making sure you cannon first and can you back to another one is really important. The next big tip that I want to give, and this one is a really important one, is that you don't want to waste your evolutions on offense. This matchup is really all about how well you can defend. Getting damage is kind of easy. I mean, you can always just go Ice Golem Hog and guarantee yourself some damage. But the real difficulty in this matchup is the defense. Can you defend? And Evo Ice Spirit and Evo Skeletons are exceptional in this matchup for defense. So wasting them on offense, especially when they have Rage as a card, just doesn't make any sense. The only time you would use it on offense is if it would guarantee you a win. If you'd win the game right there and then by making that play, then it's fine to do. But generally, save it for defense. As you saw in this matchup, I managed to win just by having good defense. So yeah, GG's. The next matchup that I'm going to be giving tips on is Hog Exe Nado. And this is a pretty balanced matchup, around 50-50. And the player that wins usually comes down to who can spell cycle and out-chip the opponent. So my first tip that I want to give you guys is when you outcycle their Nado, they obviously have two ways of countering your Hog. The first way is just simply to rocket it, and the second way is by going for a combination of Valkyrie, Ice Spirit, and Goblins, and Log, just to make sure your Hog doesn't get any damage. So when you outcycle their Nado, go for solo Hogs and Log predict their Goblins, because when you're cycling Ice Golem Hogs, most likely they're just going to rocket, you're going to get a 6-for-6 trade, and by the way, this was a misclick on this Hog, this cannon. And when you outcycle their rocket, go for an Ice Golem Hog to counter the Nado that they're going to have in hand. Because they don't have rocket, that's the best time to go for Ice Golem Hog and usually guarantee yourself at least some damage. The next tip I want to give you guys is to constantly take fireball value on really anything, but especially executioners. In this matchup, whenever they go executioner in the back, especially same lane into you, which usually you're going to be going same lane in this matchup, you want to be getting fireballs onto the executioners. Now, if possible, at the start of the game, if you get a situation where you're going opposite lane, that would be amazing. That's best case scenario. But most good Hog Exe Nado players will try going same lane into you so that once they've defended your Hogs, your Ice Golem, and your Musks, they can get that counter push and force you to defend and then make you go down Elixir and then rocket your tower. So for them, the best strategy is to go same lane, and for us, if we can, we try and go opposite lane. The next tip I want to give you guys is kind of general, but more so just to say that defense in this matchup is really easy. As long as you have good reaction times and you place your cannon in the correct placement, then they can't really break through, and they don't have any good spell to deal with musks or cannons. So as long as you're defending and you have good reaction time, it shouldn't be that hard to defend. Really, you want to focus on applying as much pressure throughout the match. Try and make them mess up. Try and make them nervous, because their strategy is very simple. Defend and rocket cycle, maybe throw in the odd hog hit here and there, but usually it's just rocket cycling. So you have to try and counter that by applying pressure. Next, I want to talk about, well, actually it's kind of in conjunction, but I said they don't have any good spell, but they do have a rocket, which means never, and I want to preface this by saying there is some more to say about this, but never go for a musketeer behind your king tower. And I'm going to clarify what I mean right now, in that you can go for your musketeer behind your king tower if they've already cycled their rocket, but if they have rocket in cycle, never cycle a musketeer same lane as they're going, with a musketeer behind your king tower. The reason is kind of obvious, you're just giving them tons of value that you shouldn't be giving. And what you should do is, often you'll find that some overzealous Hog Exe players will try going for rocket on your tower in single, and sometimes it can work, but oftentimes you can punish them not by going immediately for an Ice Golem Hog. Actually, often what you should do, especially if it's in single, is go for that musketeer behind your tower, build up as big a push as you possibly can, and then try and overwhelm them. If not in that push, then in the next one, because you can get 2 hog pushes down if they're down 6 elixir. The next thing that I kind of want to touch on is the Evo Valkyrie. Now, I did mention how you deal with it in the last matchup against Lava Void, but what I want to touch on more is how it's different in this matchup. So obviously the ways in which you'll deal with Evo Valkyrie are the same with Ice Spirit or with Ice Golem, but you have the added option in this matchup of spell cycling, so often it is the right time and a good case to fireball a Valkyrie and maybe an Ice Spirit or something if you can get it there in time. just because this is a matchup of chip, and when they're going for that Evo Valk, you can reset it, technically also with a well-timed fireball. Pretty difficult to get right, but if you can manage it, that's another great way of trying to bypass and get through the Evo Valkyrie. My next tip is that, and this is a little more, it's not really advanced, but it's something that basically it's only about your opponent. If your opponent is advanced, then this tip applies. A good Hog Exe player, once their executioner is crossing the bridge and it's coming back, the good player will nado any support troop or anything that you play towards your tower so that the executioner lines up. Now, that's something you do have to take into account because they can get thousands of damage throughout a game if they just, I mean, one lock alone is like 1,000 damage if they get two Exe hits. So you need to counter that by whenever the executioner crosses the bridge, if you have a musketeer, space out your defense as much as possible. Go for your Ice Spirit as far away at the bridge as possible away from the executioner so that when they do nado, it doesn't line up with your tower. The next matchup that I'm going to be covering is bait. There are a variety of bait decks in the game, but if you're not playing against classic log bait or log bait with Tesla, then you should have a pretty decent matchup. Normally playing against bait requires a lot of skill because you have to keep track of basically all of their cards in order to win. Most matchups you can get away with just keeping track of one or two of their cards. The first tip that I'm going to give you guys is that you need to make sure you're keeping track of their win conditions, which is usually Goblin Barrel, Princess. In this matchup they also have Wall Breakers, so you need to know when they have that in hand. And then also keep track of their hog counters. Things like Goblin Gang, Rascals, Rockets. These are all really important cards that you need to keep track of in your mind so that you know how they're going to counter your Hog Rider when you go for it, and then how you can counter their counter. The next tip I want to give you guys is that you need to figure out as quickly as you can whether or not they have a big spell. This is usually done just by deck identification, which just comes with practice. You can look up on Royal API what the current decks are. But if you know that they don't have Rocket in their deck, that means that you can freely cycle Musketeers in the back. And even if by the way, you don't know at all what deck they're running, you can figure it out throughout the game whether or not they have a Rocket. And if they do, then you can't cycle any musks or any troops really behind your King Tower. Whereas if they do have Rocket in their hands, then you can always just cycle cannons instead of musks and abuse the fact that they can't really deal with pre-placed cannons. The next tip I'm going to give you guys, and this is a really important one, is don't always log the Goblin Barrel. I know it seems crazy, but this is a matchup where it's not really, a war of attrition where you're both trying to get a bit of chip. You're both going to get damage because it's kind of impossible for both of you guys to defend flawlessly. So that means it's more of a game of who can get more damage than the other person, as opposed to who can take the least amount of damage, which is sometimes the strategy in other games. You can defend against Goblin Barrel in a variety of ways. You can actually fully counter Goblin Barrel with Ice Spirit and Skeletons. But using things like Cannon, the Cannon will also help out if it's near enough to the tower. That's something also to keep in mind. I'm going to share with you guys a tip which is a little bit more on the advanced side, but maybe you guys will be able to incorporate it into your games. It's the idea that when a Goblin Barrel is placed, there are obviously 3 goblins, and the tower always goes for the inside goblin. So it'll aim for the goblin that's closest to the middle of the arena. And that means that when you're playing your cards and you're trying to figure out which, skeletons and Ice Spirit, where to place them, you should try and place them for the other 2 goblins, which are, being tanked for by the inside goblin. And so that means you'll take the minimal amount of damage. Because your tower will target inside, you'll have things tanky for the outside goblins, and you will take some damage, usually 1 or 2 hits, but it'll limit how much damage you take. You'll keep your login cycle, and then you can go on offense and get a ton of damage yourself. The next tip that I want to give you guys, and this is something that's also very important, is depending on the deck you're playing, whether or not to predict princesses. So if you're playing against classic log bait, where they have a building and they have Goblin Gang, Knight, all of that stuff, you want to be predicting their princesses. That means you have to keep track of their princesses. That's a really bad fireball misclick. But you want to be keeping track of their princesses and then splitting and cycling your cards above your King Tower. So if they do play it at the bridge, then at least you'll have something on the field to catch it, and then you can go for a cannon onto it. If they don't have that kind of a deck, they have just a normal bait deck, like the kind of one I'm playing now. Imagine instead of Firecracker they had a princess. What you should do instead then is don't predictively try and catch the princesses. Let the princess lock, go for a cannon, and then go for a counter push. The next matchup that I'm going to be talking about is Pekka Bridge Spam. I'm also going to be covering Pekka Void at the same time. So Pekka Void and Pekka Bridge Spam is a good matchup, though it can be really difficult to defend and requires really clean technique in order to win these games. So the first tip that I'm going to give you guys is that, well, if they go for a Pekka in the back, you should go for an Ice Golem Hog opposite lane. It's not too aggressive, and you actually need to try and get that kind of damage because you have to really capitalize on opportunities you get in this matchup, because you won't be getting that many. A lot of this matchup is just making sure you're not choking the defense. My next tip is that if they have Fireball, don't cycle Musketeers in the back, and you just give them spell value. And if they have Void, then in general you don't cycle Musks too much in the back anyway, but if you are going to, make sure you're hovering some other troop, Ice Golem, Spirits, Skeletons, whatever it is. Try and catch the Void, and you really do need to keep track of their Void the whole time in this matchup. Next thing is, if they Pekka in the back, usually, now this is kind of a rule of thumb, but it doesn't always apply, but usually you don't want to go for Musketeers in the back same lane. If you can, apply pressure opposite lane, and if it makes sense. If it doesn't, then usually what you'll prioritize is actually cycling a cannon. Usually you try and stack cannons in this matchup over Musketeers. Just because that cheaper elixir costs, kind of you need it more, especially against Evo Wizards and things like that. You can sometimes get a second cannon just to snipe off an Evo Wizard, because otherwise it's quite hard to deal with it. Tip 4, I've already mentioned in another matchup, but it still applies to this, is that you need to kite Pekkas at the bridge as much as possible to allow yourself enough room to place your troops. And another tip that I also mentioned in another matchup was don't use Evos on offense. This is another matchup where your defense is really what matters. You're seeing right now how crazy Evos can be on defense. And so wasting them on offense, you may get an extra hit, but the amount of extra elixir you'll spend on defense is not worth it. So save your Evos for defense. Basically, I think 100% of the time, unless you can win the game with it. The next tip I want to give is that if you're struggling at defending Evo Battle Rams, which is quite common, you can actually Fireball log them and the support troop or the tank that's in front of it, and that will fully burst open the Evo Battle Ram, and then you can quite easily just kite it around Pekka and the Evo Battle Ram and buy yourself a lot more time. Instead of just trying to get to another cannon or something like that, which they can void, or maybe the Pekka will hit it, just try and Fireball log it sometimes, when it's appropriate. The next tip that I want to give you guys is that you should be looking for King Tower activations throughout the game. You'll see that, there's plenty of chances, though I don't manage to get it in this matchup. There are a lot of chances that you'll get, especially when you're kiting things to the middle, that if you're, astute enough, you can actually get King Tower activations off troops that you can't normally get them off. Things like bandits, marchers, and even ghosts sometimes. The next matchup that I'm going to be covering is 2.6 Mirror. Now this is a pretty interesting matchup, and the winner is usually decided by whoever can protect their musketeers better. The first tip that I'm going to give you guys is to never cycle your musketeer behind your king tower. Pretty obvious, you don't want to be giving your opponent fireball value on your musketeer and on your tower. The next tip is that you shouldn't be going Ice Golem Hog in single. Now I know I do it a few times in this game, but generally against the best players you don't want to be doing this too much unless you've outcycled their cannon, which is pretty rare. Usually because they can just go for a cannon and Ice Spirit and full count and you're giving them a positive elixir trade. You kind of have to go all in with an Ice Golem Hog Fireball to maybe get some damage, and a good player will know what to do against that. The next thing, and this is a really important one, is to switch up your cannon placements. If you're always predictably going for a cannon in the normal hog placement, they're just going to predict it. They're going to go for predictive fireballs, and you're just constantly going to lose out on the chip game. So going for a cannon at the bridge, and if they go for predictive fireball, now they've just wasted that 4 elixir. You can freely cycle a musketeer, build up a lot of a big push, and then get a lot more damage in return. So playing cannon at the bridge, sometimes playing it low, the height at which you play your cannon, you need to vary that up, and it's way more important, especially in single, to do that. Vary it. The next tip is that whenever you have a full HP musketeer counter pushing, you want to get an ice golem in front of it. 2.6 struggles to defend that without just straight up fireballing, and if they do fireball, that doesn't fully kill a musketeer or an ice golem, so they're going to have to commit either a log or a skeleton or an ice spirit. And sometimes you can actually predict it. You can go for predictive log after they fireball it. But usually you want to go for an ice golem in front so that they can't just full counter your musketeer with skeleton. Next tip is, kind of similar to not cycling behind your king towers. Also, don't cycle it in line with your tower. Cycle it somewhere outside of fireball range if you're going to play a musketeer. So that means higher up, the top 4 or 5 tiles of the arena. Next tip I'm going to give you guys is that in order to win this, you actually have to go for predictive plays. Now, that predictive plays basically is just an outcome of keeping track of their cycle. So for example, if you've outcycled their cannon, you pretty much know for sure they're going to go Ice Spirit, Skeleton's Log to try and defend your Hog because they don't have cannon. So going for a prediction log of your own to kill those cards is going to be the kind of thing that's required of you to win the game. If you don't do that, and you never go for these predictions even when you're outcycled, you're going to end up losing. The next thing is something I'm sure you guys have played if you play 2.6 a lot, and that's Hog in the Back. And surprisingly, this is somewhat new, but not that new, of an innovation, that it's actually a good play. Now, I won't go too much into the benefits of the play, but I'll teach you guys how to counter it, because oftentimes your opponent will go for Hog in the Back and you won't know what to do. So the best way of countering Hog in the Back is to go for your cannon. That's fine, you can go for an anti-fireball placement as well. But then once these troops, as Ice Golem and Hog, get closer to the bridge, go for a Musketeer towards the outside edge of the arena, but towards the bridge, and then just protect that Musketeer. That Musketeer acts as like a turret, where it'll just DPS down any troops that he plays into his push. The next matchup that I'm going to be covering is GobGiant Sparky. Now this is a really good matchup for 2.6, regardless of which variant they're running, but as with most decks, you need to have the right structure and the right game plan in order to win. So the first tip I'm going to give you guys is that in single elixir, you're never meant to fireball Sparkies. Even if you can hit the tower and the Sparky, you need to focus on applying pressure opposite lane, or if you are a really terrible cycle, just full defending GobGiant Sparky push. Now, how to defend? Well, the whole defense of GobGiant Sparky revolves around the fact that the Musketeer placement is really important. That means that you want to be playing your Musketeer last. So usually what you do is you first cycle a log, then you cycle a cannon, as I'm doing right now. The cannon goes in that anti-fireball placement. That's usually the best placement against Goblin Giants, and there are better placements. The normal placement for cannon is better against normal giant. Then you go for your cycle card, and as you just saw, you go for your cycle card on the outside of the arena, near the edge, so that once the Sparky shoots it, the recoil from the shot will push the Sparky closer to the center, and then it will lock onto your cannon. That's really important. It's a bit of a, it's kind of one of those things that separates the mid 2.6 players from the really good 2.6 players. That's something you really want to be taking into account with all of your pushes. Then after that, you have a Musketeer down that's DPSing the Goblin Giant, etc. And you can just go for Ice Spirit or Ice Golem to distract the Sparky, and then everything's dead. My third tip is that you never want to go for a Hog or Ice Golem Hog when they have Mini Pekka in cycle, like same lane. Especially Hog Rider. Ice Golem Hog situationally can make sense if you just need a bit of damage, then maybe you're in spell cycle range or something. But when they have, and this is especially in single elixir, you never really want to be doing Ice Golem Hog or Hog when they have Sparky, when they have Mini Pekka in hand, unless they don't have elixir as well. So let's say you've just finished defending a GobGiant Sparky push, they have 0 elixir, then of course it makes sense to go for a Hog opposite lane. So you need to be keeping track of their cycle and elixir. The next tip I'm going to give you guys is that this is one of those matchups where you want to focus more on your defense more than the offense, because really the offense is quite simple. It's not that hard to get damage, but you need to focus on having really clean defense. This is the kind of matchup you can actually take 0 damage if you play perfectly, and take a whole tower in return. So as long as you're defending really well, you will win the game, but that's what you need to focus on more, is your defense as opposed to your offense. Next tip is that once you're in double elixir, you guys probably know this, but it's 2 fireballs and a log for kill a Sparky, so remember to be cycling fireballs, but only in double onto Sparkies, as long as they're in the lane you're going for. And what else? Be careful of predictive zaps. That's my last and final tip. Hover other cards when you have zap in hand, and don't get predictive zap. The next matchup that I'm going to be covering is Recruit's Void Bait. Now, this is kind of a tough matchup, and the winner is usually determined by whoever can get more damage. Neither player can perfectly defend, and so it's really about who can defend better as opposed to who can get the most damage on offense. So the first tip I want to give you guys is that when they go for recruits in the back, especially at the start of the game, you should always go for a Hog Rider into it. By the time those recruits get to your Hog would have already got a ton of damage, so you're kind of forcing them to play, Goblin Gang, Goblins, Mighty Miner, which you can then get more value on your defense. The second tip I want to give you guys is that when defending recruits, the kind of structure you want to go about, especially in single, is that you want to go for a Musketeer in one lane, and then Ice Golem kite the other 3 recruits in the opposite lane to the Musketeer, whilst focusing all your attention on the Musketeers lane. So if they do void the Musketeer, then you can kind of just replace it with a cannon somewhere in the middle of the arena. And if they void, or if they go for some more pressure in the opposite lane, you can always sometimes sack damage, because sometimes they'll go too aggressive. You can take a bit of damage. Let's say they go wall breakers, maybe one of them connects, and you can just go for and support that Musketeer that you have in the right lane, because now they don't have recruits. You get a ton of damage in that way. The next tip I want to give you guys is that in double elixir, when you go for a hog and they play Evo recruits, go for a log early onto the recruit and like some bait card that they're probably going to play, and try and quickly get back to another log. Most Evo recruits pushes require you to cycle 2 logs just because of how many bait cards they're going to end up playing, and the split lane pressure is you're going to end up needing 2 sets of logs. So you want to log early as opposed to late, because if you log too late, by the time you get to that second log, you would have lost half the tower already. The next tip I want to give you guys is that you kind of want to stack. This applies more in double because you can really only do this in double. You want to stack the hell out of your masks. Now, if they're going for voids onto it, you obviously can't do that, but a lot of the time they'll find that your Musketeers, they might be able to outplay and might be able to snipe it, but there's nothing they can do against cannons. So your opponent will often try and void the cannons and then try and use arrows and like Firecracker or Goblin Gang or something like that. Just try and get to your Musketeers. So stack Musketeers and protect them. Protect them from troops, but usually I don't even really bother protecting my Musk from voids in this matchup, because it's kind of more important that your cycle cards are used to properly distract their bait cards than trying to use them to protect your masks. The next tip that I want to give you guys is that later in the game especially, you really need to maximize your hog pushes. So when you go for your hogs, applying a fireball for Goblin Gangs or a log or something like that is going to be really important, because you really need to make sure you're actually getting the most out of your hog riders. You're not going to be able to cycle too many more hogs, and then triple, it's going to be impossible. So get that damage early and win the game. The last and final matchup that I'm going to be going over for you guys is Egolem Void. Now, I played none other than the Oyasu in this matchup, so I can't think of a better example of how to beat this deck. It's a pretty tough matchup, but there are some tips that I want to give you guys to help you win this matchup. So, the first one is not to go Ice Golem Hog in single. I actually do it in this game, and you'll see that it kind of backfires. I do take a lot of damage, and it's something you can learn from that. You shouldn't really be going Ice Golem Hog in single, because they can very cheaply defend, sack some damage, and get too big of a counter push for you to defend. The next tip is that, this is kind of obvious, but this kind of applies to most decks with Void, is that you want to be stacking your Musketeers and Cannons. They can only Void one of them, and that means you'll always have at least one on the field where you need to protect that and then keep it alive and then just kite stuff around. Usually they'll Void actually your Cannons instead of your Musketeers, because that will get their E-Golem to the tower, and even if you manage to defend, you will take a ton of damage from the Elixir Golem blobs. So that allows you, at least in double elixir, to stack a ton of Musketeers, and then you can make your own counter pushes. The next tip is, especially in double elixir, focus on getting a musk down in each lane. Now, I'm saying stacking musks, but you don't want to stack them in the same lane, because they're coming in split lane pushes. If you stack musks and you have one in each lane, it kind of stops them being able to fully send in their attack in either lane, and it'll make them more hesitant. Usually they might even leak elixir, or they'll make a mistake by cycling too many troops in one lane, giving you like fireball value, or you can just go opposite lane, things like that. The next tip I want to give you guys is that it's really difficult in this matchup often to deal with the Evo Wizard. That can really be a killer, especially on offense. So don't be afraid that once you've defended the rest of the push, midway through, actually playing a cannon directly next to, not too close so that the Evo Wizard death damage hits it, but close enough so that it targets the Evo Wizard. Play your cannon on the outside of the arena just to snipe that Evo Wizard. That often is the best. Look at that play. By the way, that is usually the best way of dealing with it, or one of the ways of dealing with it. The next thing I want to say is that you need to be able to predict their plays in this matchup. That means the most common way to defend Ice Golem Hog for them is just by going for a Night Witch, taking damage and getting a huge counter push, or going for E-Golem Wizard. These are usually the two ways that they try and defend Ice Golem Hog. So make sure you're not going for these massive attacks unless you're sure you can defend. When they build a huge double lane push, this is my next tip, you need to prioritize on killing that first Elixir Golem, because it's going to give you that Elixir back quickly, which you're going to need for the rest of the push. That's basically the template for defending all Elixir Golem pushes. Make sure you're killing that first E-Golem to try and get that Elixir back. that's it, guys. That's the full 2.6 guide. I hope you guys enjoyed. Like and subscribe. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.